Hello, traveler. You're tired, and it's time to rest. We've gathered by the campfire to relax and listen to ancient stories. Grab your cup of warm drink and join us. Let this starry night completely capture our attention. In the far, far north, where the sky often wears the color of iron and the snow sings softly over forgotten hills, there lies a land untouched by the march of time. The world here does not end, it only sleeps under layers of frost and silence. Beyond the wall, past where the old kings once hunted and where giants now tread only in song, a legend stirs like embers in the heart of a long-dead fire. Long ago, when the direwolves still roamed in proud packs and the name Stark carried the weight of justice and winter's truth, there lived a prince, a son not born of thrones, but of wild wind and loyal shadows. He was a Stark, though his name was seldom sung, and with him walked a beast of such might and mystery that even the old gods watched in silence. A dire hound, they called it, though it bore the blood of no known beast, as large as a small horse. Its coat was black as moonless nights, its eyes ember red and mournful. It was said the wolfhound's howl could stir the dead and calm the storm. Some whispered it was not a beast at all, but a spirit, sent to guard the line of wolves until the world's last snowfall. And then the prince vanished, betrayed, the songs say, by those who feared the old blood. He fell not in battle, but in silence, swallowed by snow and treachery. And the hound, it too vanished, though not without trace. Tracks in the frost, bones found half buried in mourning, strange shapes moving through blizzards. The people spoke its name no longer, but in the stillest hours when firelight grew thin and fear thickened the air, some whispered of the wolfhound. Many years passed, houses fell and rose, kings burned and were crowned. The wall, once the shield of realms, stood as a broken sentinel, its magic faded like breath on glass. The long night had come and gone, and with it the world had changed. But the North remembered. It is here, in this realm of whispering snow and slumbering gods, that our story begins again. Her name was Mayra. She was small, not yet grown, but in her eyes danced the wild light of her people. Born beyond the wall to a mother who spoke to trees and a father lost to raiders, Mayra had always felt the pull of places others feared. Her village was little more than a scattering of huts stitched together with stories and smoke, clinging to life in a world of ice and wind. Most of her kin feared the deeper woods, the white hills, the ancient stones that loomed like sentinels of sorrow. But Mayra dreamed of them. Since she could first walk, she had wandered further than she should, touching bark older than kings, listening to the earth hum beneath her bare feet, sleeping beneath the stars when she ought to have been beside the hearth, and more often than not, she dreamed, not of simple things, no warm bread or soft wool or songs by firelight. No, her dreams were filled with teeth and snow, with red eyes in darkness, and a voice like a storm under ice. A great black shape, always watching, always waiting. It never harmed her, never growled, but it watched. And she woke each time with the same feeling in her chest, a soft ache, a pull, as if part of her were meant to follow. Child of bones, the old women called her. the dreaming girl. One such night, when the stars were sharp as blades and the snow fell in slow, deliberate silence, Mira left. There had been no plan, no gathering of food or maps, only a whisper in her heart and the scent of pine and something older on the wind. She left behind her mother's carved bone talisman and her place by the fire, stepping into the dark with nothing but a cloak, a flint, and the dreams that had haunted her since the moon first kissed her brow. The trees welcomed her. They bowed gently as she passed, their bare limbs creaking with memories too old for words. The snow crunched beneath her feet like breath held too long. For hours she walked, or perhaps days, it mattered little. Time bent in the north. Night lingered long, and the sky often forgot to blink. Then, as the wind began to howl, not in rage, but in warning, she heard it, a cry, low and long, woven with sorrow and strength. It was not the howl of any wolf, nor the keen of wind through mountain pass. It was the sound she had heard in her dreams, only now it lived, shivering through the marrow of the world. She froze, her breath caught like a snared hare, and then she ran. Up the ridge, past ancient stones slick with frost, through thickets of gray thorn that tore her cloak and kissed her skin with thin red lines. She ran toward the howl, as if the sound had curled around her ribs and was pulling her forward like a tether of fate. At the crest of the ridge, she stopped. The world below was a sea of white and shadow. A frozen lake stretched like a silver scar across the valley. Trees ringed its edges like guardians in mourning, and on the far side, standing as still as stone, was a shape that stole her breath. It was enormous, dark as the heart of night, and it watched her, unmoving, as though it had always known she would come. The Wolfhound, her legs trembled, not with fear, but with recognition, with wonder. She took a step forward. It did not move. The snow fell between them like a veil, silent, sacred. She whispered, though she did not know why, "I dreamed of you." The Wolfhound blinked, slow and solemn, and then it turned, disappearing into the forest without a sound, leaving only its tracks behind, deep and deliberate in the snow. Mira stared at the place where it had stood. Her breath formed clouds in the air. Her heart thundered, and she knew she would follow, not just for answers, not just for the legend, but because something in her soul had woken, and it was hungry for truth. The valley lay still in the Wolfhound's wake, as if the world itself dared not disturb the silence left behind. Mira stood unmoving, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest like snowfall layered over time. The trees rustled softly behind her, their bare limbs whispering secrets to one another, while the great frozen lake below glistened like a forgotten mirror, holding the sky captive in its embrace. For a time she did not breathe, not truly. Her eyes searched the dark edge of the forest where the beast had vanished, as though it might step back into view, as though it might simply be waiting to see if she would dare to follow. Her fingers trembled against the edge of her cloak, clutching the tattered wool like it could anger her to reason. But reason had no hold here. Not in this place, not in this dream made real. Slowly, with the reverence of one approaching sacred ground, Mera began her descent. Each step down the ridge came with a softness, a deliberate quiet, as though she feared waking something ancient and unseen. Her boots left shallow impressions in the snow, already beginning to fill with drifting flakes. The air around her was still, not dead but listening, as if even the wind had stilled to hear the sound of her breath. She walked without thought of direction, guided only by instinct and that faint echo in her bones, the dreamlike knowing that this was not simply a place she had found, but one that had always been waiting for her. By the time she reached the lake's edge, the light had shifted. The gray sky had dimmed to a deep silver, not quite dusk, not quite dawn, that peculiar hour in the north when the sun lingers behind the mountains and forgets how to rise. Mera knelt by the lake, brushing aside the snow with her bare hand until her fingers touched the ice beneath. It was colder than she expected, so cold it burned, but beneath the surface, trapped in the stillness, she thought she saw something move, not a fish nor a current, but a flicker of shadow, too slow for wind, too silent for a beast. She stared longer, but it did not return. Only her reflection remained, wide-eyed, pale, rimmed with frost. A low sound stirred behind her, wood groaning, not from wind or weather, but from something massive brushing past the trees. Mera turned swiftly, her breath catching, but there was no sign of the hound, only the broken line of its tracks leading into the trees where the boughs hung heavy with snow and shadow. She rose and followed, each footfall drawing her deeper into the forest's breathless hush. The woods here were older than her village's memory, untouched by axes or fire, left to twist and reach in their own wild will. The trees rose tall and thin like the bones of forgotten giants, their trunks slick with frost, their roots curling like frozen serpents through the earth. Mera moved carefully, not with fear, but with the quiet awe of one who knows they are no longer alone. The hound's prints veered east, winding through the trees in deliberate patterns, as if it were not fleeing, but leading, as if it wished to be found, but only by one who knew how to seek with heart rather than eyes. Time stretched thin in that forest. There was no day, no night, only the soft weight of snowfall and the endless hush of ancient breath. Hours passed, or perhaps none did at all. Mera's legs ached, her hands numb to the bone, but still she walked. Something within her refused to stop. It was not merely curiosity, it was a calling, a thread woven into her spirit before she had even taken her first breath. The dreams had not lied. The hound was real, and with it something more. A truth buried in winter's silence, waiting to be unearthed. When she finally reached the clearing, the light had shifted again. The air glowed with a pale, silvery blue hue, not from moon or sun, but from something within the ground itself. The trees formed a perfect ring around the glade, their trunks impossibly straight, their limbs arching overhead like cathedral arches made of ice and bark. And in the center, half buried in snow, stood a stone. It was not large, but it pulsed faintly with warmth, steam curling around its edges where the snow could not cling. Runes, weathered and worn, wrapped around its base, etched so deeply into the surface that even the seasons had not erased them. Mera approached slowly, her breath misting before her like smoke from an old fire. She reached out, fingers trembling, and placed her hand upon the stone. The warmth was immediate. not hot, but comforting, like the memory of a hearth on a winter's night or the touch of a mother's hand on a fevered brow. As her fingers traced the runes, they lit softly beneath her touch, each one flaring for a heartbeat before dimming again. A deep hum vibrated through the air, a resonance that seemed to reach down into her chest, curling around her heart like a song too old for words. And then, movement. From the tree line, the wolfhound emerged once more. It stepped into the glade with the silence of falling snow, its eyes locked onto hers with a gaze that pierced through flesh and thought alike. It did not growl. It did not threaten. It simply stood there, proud and still, as if waiting for her to speak. But what could she say? Mara opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she knelt before the stone, lowered her head, and whispered into the snow, "I don't know why I'm here, only that I had to come." The hound stepped closer. Its paws made no sound. Its breath, when it came, misted the air in slow, solemn clouds. It stopped just before her, its massive head lowering until its muzzle brushed her hand. And in that moment, something passed between them, not in words, not in thought, but in memory. A battlefield, a broken banner, snow-stained red, and beside it, the wolfhound, chained not by steel but by grief, standing guard over a body long since claimed by frost, the prince, the forgotten Stark, and the hound that would not leave his side, even as the world turned and the blood froze. Mira gasped, pulling her hand back. The vision faded, but its weight remained. She looked up into the hound's eyes. They were not red with rage, but with sorrow. "You remember," she whispered. "You still wait." And the hound, slowly, gently, lowered itself to the snow beside her. Together in that ring of ancient trees, beneath the gaze of stars that had watched kingdoms rise and fall, girl and beast sat in silence, two remnants, bound now not by prophecy but by choice. The wind began to stir once more, weaving through the trees with a low, ancient murmur, as though the forest itself had drawn a breath it had not taken in 1,000 years. Mira sat motionless beside the wolfhound, her body folded against the snow, her hand still tingling where its muzzle had touched. There was no fear between them now. Only a hush, vast and heavy, the kind that exists only in places where time is not counted by clocks or calendars, but by memory and silence. The hound's breath was slow and deep, its chest rising and falling in a rhythm that soothed the wild rhythm of her heart. It was not the breath of a monster or a beast. It was the breath of something old, something sacred, something weary. Mira leaned back slightly and looked up through the latticework of bare branches overhead, where stars blinked in the velvet sky like ancient runes etched into the heavens. The night had fallen fully now, though she hadn't noticed its coming. In the north, dusk and midnight often held hands, blurring the edge between light and dark until one could no longer tell which ruled the sky. But here in the glade the pale light remained, not from moon or star, but from the stone itself, still gently aglow with the touch of her fingers. Its warmth had not faded, and neither had the memory it stirred. The image of the battlefield haunted her, the frozen banner, the blood-soaked snow, the prince's lifeless form. Yet what had etched itself deepest into her soul was not the death, but the loyalty. The way the hound had stood its vigil, unmoving, undeterred, even as the seasons turned and the world changed. That kind of faith, that kind of devotion, it was not of this age. It belonged to the stories of the old gods. The songs sung when the world was still half dream. It belonged to legends. And yet here it was, breathing beside her. She turned her eyes toward the hound again, studying it closely. Its coat was darker than shadow, its fur matted with flecks of ice and time. But its eyes, those deep, ember-red eyes, held the weight of centuries. They did not shine with madness or hunger, but with knowing. There was intelligence in them, yes, but more than that there was grief. The kind of grief that had forgotten the sound of its own name, grief that had folded itself into silence and become a part of the landscape. "What are you?" Mera whispered into the quiet, not truly expecting an answer, but needing to offer the question as one might offer a gift or a prayer. Or who? The hound's ears flicked at her voice, but it did not rise. Instead, it pressed its massive head into the snow, resting its chin against the frozen earth, and closed its eyes. Mera felt a strange pang in her chest, as though a thread had been pulled taut inside her. A thread tied to something older than memory, deeper than blood. It was then that she understood. This creature was not waiting for orders, nor for praise. It was waiting for permission, for release, or perhaps for purpose. And in that quiet revelation, Mera felt something shift within her. The journey she had begun under stars and instinct was no longer a wandering. It was a path. A trail written not in words, but in echoes, in frost, in dream, in the hush between howls. She had not found the Wolfhound by chance. She had been called. The next morning, or what passed for morning in the sunless hush of the north, Mera woke with the hound still beside her. Snow had fallen lightly over the glade during the night, softening the world into something half real, half remembered. She sat up slowly, brushing frost from her cloak, and reached into the small satchel at her side for the last of her dried roots and berries. She ate in silence, sparing a few scraps and gently placing them before the hound, who opened one eye and sniffed without judgment. It did not eat, but neither did it move away. Instead, it rose slowly, stretched like some ancient cat, and turned toward the east edge of the clearing. There it paused, looking back at her, as though waiting to see if she would follow. Mera's breath clouded in the cold as she stood. The ache in her limbs was deep but not unkind. It was the ache of movement, of journey, of purpose. She took a step toward the hound and then another. The snow crunched beneath her feet, the only sound in that vast, listening world. The wolfhound turned and moved ahead, slow and deliberate, its paws silent against the frost. They walked together, not with the urgency of prey or the certainty of maps, but with a rhythm that felt older than walking, older than the land itself. The forest slowly thinned as they traveled, giving way to wide ridges and plains where the snow clung in long wind-blown waves, carving white rivers across the earth. Above them the sky wept with clouds that never rained, only watched. The world felt suspended, caught between heartbeat and breath. As the day wore on, the wind rose, no longer a whisper, but a voice. It howled through the trees behind them, stirring snow from the branches in swirling ghosts, and Mera could feel it against her bones. The land was waking. Something was stirring beneath the ice. something not seen in many lifetimes. They reached a plateau near dusk. From here, the land opened like a broken bowl, jagged and white, stretching out toward the dark horizon where mountains stood like teeth. At the edge of the plateau stood ruins, old stones half buried, carved with symbols worn smooth by time. The hound paused there, sitting solemnly beside the largest stone, a flat slab that had once been a foundation or a tomb. Mara approached, her heart thudding softly. The carvings here were not the same as those in her village. They were older, more primal, like scratches left by gods in their dreaming. Her fingers brushed across the surface, tracing spirals and sigils she did not recognize, yet somehow understood. They spoke not in language, but in memory. And then she saw it. In the center of the stone, nearly obscured by snow and lichen, was a sigil she had seen only once before, carved into the talisman her mother had left her. The same circle, the same 4 lines crossing it like stars. A mark of the old blood, a mark of the first pact. Mira's breath caught. She looked at the Wolfhound. "You were bound to them, weren't you?" she whispered. "To the first ones, the kings before crowns, the wolves before words." The hound gave no answer, but it did not need to. The truth was in its silence. In this place, on this stone, the pact had been made. Perhaps, if the land was stirring again, it was not yet broken. The silence upon the plateau thickened with a reverence that did not belong to the present age. It was a silence layered with old promises, where the snow did not merely fall, but remembered. Mira stood unmoving before the ancient stone, her fingers still pressed to the carved symbol that mirrored the one on her mother's talisman, an emblem she had worn as a charm against storms, not knowing it was the key to a history buried beneath the frost. Around her the wind gathered, not cold but ceremonial, as though the air itself sought to speak but had forgotten the shape of words. The Wolfhound remained by her side, its gaze never straying from the horizon, its body poised, not in rest but in devotion. It was not the posture of a beast guarding territory, nor even of one protecting a friend. It was the stance of a sentinel, an oath etched not in blood, but in spirit. The runes beneath her palm pulsed faintly now, as if they too responded to the bond between girl and hound. They thrummed not with power, but with recognition. In the stillness of that moment, Mira understood the truth not as a lesson learned, but as a memory returned. These stones were not ruins, they were altars. They had stood witness to a covenant older than any house, older than the wall, older even than the old tongue. Here, in the breathless dawn of men and gods, a pact had been made between those who walked in flesh and those who roamed as shadow, between wolves and kin, guardians and wanderers, blood and frost. And the pact, it seemed, had frayed. Not broken, no, not entirely, but unraveled strand by strand across centuries of forgetting. The Wolfhound was its last echo, the final guardian of an oath that had outlived the tongues that spoke it, the hands that wrote it in stone. And now that oath pulsed in Mira's veins like a song her heart had always known. Not because she was chosen by prophecy, nor because her blood was noble, but because she had listened when the world whispered, she had come when the howl called. And perhaps, in the eyes of the old magic, that was enough. As twilight fell across the sky like a silver veil, the hound moved again. It rose without sound, walked around the edge of the altar, and began to dig, not with frenzy but with purpose. Its massive paws carved through the snow and into the dirt beneath, each movement steady, rhythmic, as though uncovering not a thing, but a memory. Mira watched in breathless stillness as the creature unearthed what lay hidden beneath the stone's edge. A bundle of cloth, darkened by centuries and hardened by time. The hound stepped back once the shape was fully revealed, lowering its head in what felt like reverence. Mira approached slowly, kneeling before the bundle with hands that trembled despite the cold. She peeled back the outer layer with care, revealing within a sheath of old leather, cracked and weathered, wrapped tight around a slender object. A sword. Its hilt was bound in iron and obsidian, its blade untouched by rust or time. Symbols ran along its length, sharp, clean, and deeply etched, echoing the runes on the stone and the talisman alike. This was no weapon forged in modern fire. This was a relic of the pact, a blade not for war but for remembrance, a key, a question, a promise. Mira held it in her hands, and it felt neither foreign nor heavy. It felt like coming home. The hound let out a low, breathy sound somewhere between a sigh and a growl, and turned its eyes once more to the east, where the mountains loomed like sleeping beasts. Mira followed its gaze, the sword resting across her knees, the runes glowing faintly beneath her fingertips. Something waited in those mountains. Not an enemy, but an answer, a reckoning. She did not know what shape it would take, or whether it would bring peace or ruin. But the hound would not have led her here without reason. Its watch had lasted lifetimes, and now it had chosen to move again. That night, beneath a canopy of stars that whispered like forgotten songs, Mira sat beside a small fire, the sword laid reverently before her, its point sunk gently into the earth. The wolfhound slept in a circle of shadow nearby, its breath slow and deep. The flame flickered, casting shifting gold over stone and fur and frost. And Mira let her eyes drift shut, her thoughts weaving between dream and memory. In the hush that came, she saw a vision, not with eyes, but with the soul. She stood atop a cliff of white stone, wind howling around her, cloak snapping like a banner. Before her knelt the wolfhound, proud and eternal, its eyes aflame not with fire, but with light. And behind it 1,000 more shapes emerged from the mists, shadows of wolves, spirits of wind and snow, guardians once bound by the same oath. They circled her, not in menace but in mourning. Each bore a wound not of flesh but of forgetting. Their names had been lost, their purpose scattered like ash, and yet they bowed before her, as if the memory of the pact still lingered in their bones. A voice spoke, deep and distant, not from a mouth, but from the land itself. The blood remembers what the tongue forgets. Wake the pact, call the shadow, bind the howl. Mira gasped as the dream faded, her eyes flying open to the night sky above. The fire had burned low, and the sword before her pulsed softly in the dark, like a heartbeat echoing from the earth. The hound raised its head, watching her in silence. "I saw them," she whispered. "The others." The hound did not blink. "They're waiting." still it made no sound. Mira stood slowly, brushing snow from her cloak, the sword now sheathed across her back. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she felt no fear, only resolve. Whatever the mountains held, whoever waited in the old shadows, she would find them. She would wake what had slept for too long, and she would not walk alone. Beside her the wolfhound rose, its great frame casting a long shadow across the snow. Together they stepped into the dark. The climb into the mountains was not swift, nor was it kind. It was the sort of ascent that tested the marrow of a soul, where each step forward demanded something be left behind. The land grew sharper with each breath, its contours shifting from gentle hills and snow-stilled forests into jagged cliffs and brittle ice-cloaked ridges that jutted from the earth like broken ribs. The wind did not howl here. It screamed, carving its lament through stone and spirit alike, and yet Mira did not falter. Wrapped in her tattered cloak, her fingers raw with cold and her lips cracked from the dry chill, she followed the wolfhound with the calm of one who no longer questioned whether she belonged. The blade across her back pressed lightly into her shoulders, not burdensome but steadying, as though it were not she who bore it, but it who bore her. The wolfhound walked without pause, tireless and measured, its paws making no sound even on the brittle ice. Its great form cut a path through snowdrifts and wind alike, and when it paused it did so not to rest, but to listen. At times it would raise its head high, ears twitching, nose pointed into the gale, and Mira would follow its gaze, wondering what unseen thing stirred in the heart of the peaks. Once, just once, she heard it, a sound like the cry of something lost, carried across the wind from a distance so vast it might as well have been memory. It was not human, not beast. It was pain, pulled thin and long until it became part of the landscape. The hound made no answer, but its gait quickened, and Mayra matched it step for step, though her legs screamed with the effort and her breath came shallow and sharp. They climbed for 2 days without speaking. There was no need. In this realm of cold and stone, words were brittle things, easily shattered. Instead, they shared the silence, the heavy, holy kind that gathered between kindred spirits. Mayra had never known such stillness before, not even in her dreaming. It was not the stillness of emptiness, but of presence. The mountains were alive, and they watched with eyes hidden in stone and sky. They judged her, weighed her, and slowly, silently, they seemed to accept her. On the 3rd day, the pass narrowed into a ravine, its walls sheer and blackened by time, its floor a frozen river whose surface glistened beneath a sky painted with pale northern fire. Here the wolfhound paused. It turned its head back to Mera and let out a soft, rumbling exhale, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. It stepped forward, slowly now, placing each paw with deliberate care, and Mera followed with equal caution. There was something sacred about this place. The cold felt deeper but not cruel. The air tasted of iron and memory. Every stone, every shadow, whispered of things long buried. At the center of the ravine stood a monolith. Unlike the altar in the glade, this stone was tall, twice Mira's height, and as wide as the trunks of the oldest trees. It was wrapped in thick roots that had frozen mid-growth, their gnarled limbs like the fingers of something trying to claw its way back into the world. Carvings covered the monolith's surface, swirling labyrinthine symbols that pulsed faintly beneath the frost, as if the stone itself still breathed. The wolfhound stopped before it, bowing its head so low that its snout brushed the ground. Mera did the same, unsure why, only that it felt right. The wind hushed as they stood there, and in that silence the mountain spoke, not in words, not in voice, but in weight, in sensation. Mera staggered as a pressure settled over her, not crushing, but all-encompassing, like standing beneath the sea or within a dream that remembered it was real. Her mind flooded with visions, though her eyes did not close. She saw flames licking across a great hall of ice and stone, where figures cloaked in wolf pelts sat in silence, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. She saw the pact written not on paper but in wounds, blood offered to stone, breath given to frost. She saw the wolfhound again, standing at the feet of a man with a crown of woven branches and eyes like snow. Not a prince, not a king, but something older, one who ruled not with law, but with spirit. Then the vision shifted, the pact breaking. Slowly at first, forgotten rituals left unspoken, ancestral paths abandoned for cities and coin. Then, more violently, hunts turned to slaughter, the sacred beasts felled for sport, the old words mocked, the old stones buried. The wolves retreated, the guardians faded, the hound stood alone, and still it waited. The mountain's vision faded, and Mera dropped to her knees, gasping, the cold biting through her cloak like a blade. The hound stepped forward and placed its head against her shoulder, its breath warm, grounding. She gripped its fur, clinging not from fear but from understanding. The pact had not been merely forgotten. It had been betrayed. And now something stirred in the far dark, something that knew the oath was broken and sought to fill the silence with shadow. "We have to renew it," she whispered, her voice cracking like ice underfoot. "We have to remember." The wolfhound raised its head, eyes bright as flame against the twilight. It turned and began to walk again, this time not across the open snow, but toward a narrow crevice hidden in the cliff face behind the monolith. Mera followed, the sword across her back humming softly as though it too felt the change in the air. The entrance was small, nearly swallowed by rock and time, but beyond it lay a tunnel that descended into the heart of the mountain. The air inside was warmer, tinged with the scent of moss and iron, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly along the stone. They descended in silence, the path winding ever downward, as if seeking the bones of the world itself. The light dimmed, but Mera did not fear the dark. The sword pulsed gently, casting a faint glow, and the hound's presence ahead of her was a living lantern. The deeper they went, the more the walls began to change. Carvings emerged again, but these were different, older still. They depicted not men and wolves, but stars and beasts of fire, rivers that walked like people, trees that spoke and bled gold. The stories of the world before stories, etched in the belly of the earth. At last they reached the chamber. It was vast, hollowed by time and reverence, its ceiling lost in shadow. At its center stood a pool, still and black as obsidian, ringed with stones etched with the same runes as the sword and altar. The wolfhound stepped to the edge of the water and looked back at Mera. Slowly she approached. In the water, she saw her reflection, and something more. Not just her face, not just her eyes, but a girl wrapped in starlight, surrounded by a ring of wolves whose eyes shone like suns, standing before a circle of ancient ones, cloaked in bark and bone. She saw herself lift the sword, not to strike but to offer, and the earth opened. The hound growled softly, not a warning but a beckon. Mera drew the sword, held it before her with both hands, and stepped toward the water. And as the blade touched the surface, the pool lit from within, and the mountain began to sing. The song that rose from the heart of the mountain was not a melody in the way a harp or pipe might play, nor was it a chant one could learn or hum. It was a resonance, deep and layered, a language older than words, older even than thought. It rang through the chamber with the gravity of oceans shifting, of stars speaking to stone. The pool at Mera's feet glowed with a light not of fire or sun, but of memory, distilled into form, shimmering with the color of morning and hope. The sword in her hands pulsed in harmony, its blade humming with the same rhythm that now throbbed in the marrow of her bones. She stood motionless, the blade's tip just kissing the water's surface. Her breath held not from fear, but from reverence. She understood, without instruction, without reason, that what stood before her was not a pool, not a mirror, but a gate. Not one to another place, but to another time, another truth. One buried beneath ice and silence. As the song swelled, the wolfhound circled the chamber's edge with slow, deliberate steps, each movement echoing like a heartbeat in the stone. It did not howl, it did not growl, it simply moved, as though retracing a pattern once danced in fire and frost by those who came before. Its eyes never left Mera, and in their crimson glow she saw not command, but trust. It had brought her here not to wield power, but to awaken it. Not the power to rule, but the power to remember, and in remembering, to mend what had been broken. The light in the water shifted, and Mera saw not her reflection now, but visions unfurling like leaves in spring. She saw the first pact in its birth, a gathering beneath blood-red skies, where men and beasts and things between knelt as equals around a circle of stone. Words were spoken, but not with tongues, oaths carved into being with breath and blood, with smoke and snow. She saw the forging of the sword not in fire but in sacrifice, its blade bathed in starlight, its edge tempered in silence. She saw the guardians born, the great wolf spirits that bound themselves to the pact, forsaking immortality for vigilance, their forms solidified not through flesh but through will. The wolfhound was the last of them, she now understood, not a creature of this world, but a memory too strong to fade. But then came the fall. Not sudden, not loud, but slow. The pact was not shattered by a single act of treachery, but by 1,000 small betrayals. Forests cleared for ease, rivers redirected for pride, wolves hunted not from hunger but fear. The memory of the pact grew distant. Those who remembered were called mad, those who kept vigil were called monsters, and so the hound retreated, the stones fell silent, and the sword was hidden beneath sorrow and snow. Until now, until her, the water went still, the light dimming once more, and Mera lowered the sword gently into the pool. The blade sank without resistance, vanishing beneath the surface as if drawn by a hand unseen. For a moment there was only silence, the kind that hums in the bones after thunder. Then the pool surged with light, and from its heart rose a column of brilliance, shaped like flame, like wind, like memory given form. Within it the blade re-emerged, no longer bound in leather and shadow. It shone with a clarity that made the air tremble. The runes along its length blazed with blue fire, and the hilt pulsed with a steady glow like a heartbeat reborn. Mera reached out, and as her fingers closed around it, the song shifted. It became sharper, clearer, no longer a lament but a summoning, a call. The blade was no longer a relic, it was a beacon. The wolfhound approached, lowering its head until its muzzle brushed the edge of the pool. Mera turned toward it, the blade held before her like a candle in the dark. The hound's eyes locked with hers, and in them she saw a question not spoken in words. "Are you ready?" She nodded, not from confidence, but from understanding. This was not a trial she had passed, nor a destiny she had claimed. This was a vow she had chosen. She was not born to it. She had walked toward it. The mountain trembled. A sound like ice cracking, like stone waking, echoed through the chamber. The carvings along the walls flared to life, bathing the room in light and shadow. Symbols turned like wheels, unlocking something vast and ancient beneath the earth. The path had been opened, the pact had been acknowledged, but it was not yet renewed. To do that they would need to go deeper, not into stone, but into memory, into sorrow, into the place where the first promise had been broken. The wolfhound turned and padded toward the far side of the chamber, where an archway had begun to form, hewn not by hands but by force of remembrance. Through it lay a staircase spiraling downward into darkness, its edges lit with flickering symbols that danced like fireflies. Mera followed, the sword held low, its tip tracing arcs of light against the walls. The air here was warmer, thicker, not in temperature, but in emotion. It pressed against her chest with the weight of all things left unsaid. As they descended, the silence grew louder. She began to hear things, not with her ears, but in the aching hollows of her heart. A mother's lullaby, a child's cry in the woods, the crack of bone, the hiss of steel. Memories not hers, but left behind like echoes trapped in glass. The very stone of the staircase remembered, and it shared that remembrance with every step. By the time they reached the bottom, Mera's eyes burned with unshed tears, her fingers white-knuckled around the blade. This was not simply a test of strength. This was a rite of grief. They emerged into a circular chamber, its walls shaped like the inside of a tree, twisted with roots and veined with silver. At the center stood a single stone seat, its surface smooth from centuries of waiting. The wolfhound circled the seat once, then lay beside it, its eyes fixed on Mera. She understood. This was the place where the first promise had been broken, where the last guardian had stood, where the vow had bled into earth. She approached the seat and stood before it, the blade resting in both hands, its weight suddenly immense. "I am Mera," she said, her voice steady though her throat trembled. "Daughter of the snow, child of no house, speaker of dreams. I come not to rule but to remember. I come not to command but to bind. The roots along the walls quivered. The silver veins pulsed with light. The air thickened, holding its breath. Mira raised the sword, holding it aloft. I vow to walk with shadow, to listen when the earth speaks, to howl when the wind forgets its song. I vow to guard the silence, to speak the names of the forgotten, to honor the wolves who still wait. And as the last word left her lips, the sword flared with light. And the mountain answered. The light that erupted from the blade did not merely shine. It poured. It flooded the chamber with a brilliance that defied color, too vast and deep to be called silver or blue or gold. It was the light of promise remembered, of bonds reforged, of silence at last given voice. The roots in the walls convulsed gently, as if exhaling a breath they had held for an age. The silver veins pulsed brighter, flowing with some living essence long dormant. Mira stood at the center of it all, the sword raised like a beacon, her body trembling under the sheer magnitude of what was unfolding. Yet within her tremble was not fear, but release. The blade hummed in her hands, no longer a relic, no longer just a symbol. It was now the vessel of her oath, and through it, the oath of all those who had stood before her, guardians and dreamers, wolves and watchers, voices forgotten by time and silence alike. The wolfhound had not moved during the ritual. It lay as still as stone, its eyes closed, its breath deep and even, as though it had entered some dream not meant for mortals. But as the last echo of Mira's vow faded into the chamber's pulse, the hound stirred. It lifted its head slowly and opened its eyes. Not the deep ember red they had been, but something new. A pale, glimmering hue like moonlight trapped in water, like the light of stars before names were given to them. The change was subtle but undeniable. The hound had not simply heard the oath, it had been changed by it. Bound anew, a warmth bloomed in Mira's chest then, not from within her body, but as though the mountain itself was embracing her. She looked up, and in the high curve of the chamber, a constellation of lights appeared. No stars, not truly, but memories, faces, moments, beings once flesh, now woven into the stone and root of the earth. Some bore the forms of wolves, others of people. All watched in silence, their presence immense yet weightless. Mira felt no judgment in them, only sorrow and hope. Then, one by one, the lights began to descend. Each drifted downward like a snowflake of memory, coming to rest along the chamber's floor, around Mira and the wolfhound, forming a circle. Each light pulsed once, acknowledgement, blessing, farewell. And then they faded into the roots, their light absorbed, their presence now a part of the place once more. Their vigil was over. The renewal had begun. The sword dimmed gradually, its brilliance softening to a glow of steady flame. Mira lowered it with reverent care and looked to the wolfhound. The creature rose, its limbs slow but strong, and approached her until its muzzle was level with her heart. It touched her chest lightly, and in that touch a warmth spread. Not heat, but connection, an exchange, not of power, but of memory. It was giving her something, not just loyalty, not just its presence. It was giving her its name, not in sound, but in knowing. The name was not a word, it was a feeling, a season, a place beneath the stars where no harm could reach, no sorrow could thrive, a sound between silence and wind, and though Mira could not speak it aloud, she felt it settle into her spirit like a stone into still water. She was no longer alone. She never had been. She simply hadn't known the shape of the presence that had always walked beside her. They stood there for a long time, girl and guardian, torch and memory, vow and vessel. Then, without signal or command, they turned together toward the archway from which they had come. The roots and silver veins shifted gently, parting like curtains before them, revealing a new path, one that had not been there before, a tunnel carved in dark crystal and old bone, leading upward, not back the way they came, but toward the sky, toward the surface. Their ascent was quieter than the descent had been, but it was no less profound. The air changed gradually from thick and dream-laden to crisp and thin. The light from the blade illuminated the crystal walls with patterns that flickered and danced, echoes of the old oath still reverberating, casting ripples through the very marrow of the earth. The Wolfhound walked beside her now, no longer leading, no longer guiding. They moved as equals. Companion. When at last they reached the end of the tunnel, the world opened with such suddenness that it stole Mira's breath. They emerged upon a high cliff, overlooking a vast and ancient valley that spread below them like a tapestry of forgotten truths. It was not the same land they had climbed through. Here the snow was softer, the light clearer. Great trees stood tall, their boughs unbroken by storm or time, and rivers of mist wound through the valley like veins of breath. The sky was full of pale fire, the kind that only burns when the sun has stepped aside for something older. And in the distance, black specks moved, shapes too large to be deer, too graceful to be bears, shapes that moved in silence and shadow, low to the ground, swift as wind. Wolves. Not dream things. Not ghosts. Living. Real. And they turned their heads toward the cliff, ears twitching, eyes bright with recognition. One among them lifted its muzzle and let loose a howl, not of warning, not of sorrow, but of welcome. The Wolfhound beside Mira answered, and the valley trembled with the harmony of their voices. Mira dropped to her knees, overwhelmed not with fear or awe, but with the simple, crushing beauty of belonging. She had wandered through dream and snow, shadow and silence, all for this, to remember. To be remembered. The pact had not died, it had only waited, and now it was stirring again, not as law, not as ritual, but as bond, as choice. The wolves in the valley began to move, upward, toward the cliff, silent and swift, a tide of fur and memory returning to the shore of a truth long thought lost. Mira stood, sword still glowing, eyes wet with tears she could not explain. The Wolfhound stepped forward, standing at the edge of the cliff, watching its kin draw near. Then it looked back at her, not for guidance, but for permission. And Mira, her voice shaking with the vastness of the moment, whispered just one word, "Go." And the Wolfhound leapt, not down, not away, but forward, into the future being written step by step, howl by howl. The leap was not a fall, it was flight, of a kind. The Wolfhound soared down the cliffside with the grace of something returning to itself, paws barely touching the ledges as it descended, drawn not by gravity, but by gravity's memory. Below, the wolves gathered like shadows woven from moonlight, their eyes glinting not with menace but with wonder, as if they too had dreamt of this moment and were unsure whether they had woken or merely slipped deeper into some long-awaited dream. They did not charge to greet the hound, nor did they scatter in awe. Instead, they parted slowly, reverently, forming a wide circle at the base of the cliff. At its center, the wolfhound came to rest. Tall, proud, still, and for the first time since Mira had seen it emerge from the veil of snow, it lowered its head, not in grief, but in welcome. From above, Mira watched, her fingers still curled loosely around the hilt of the blade, though its glow had dimmed to a quiet shimmer, more ember than flame. The chill of the mountain wind wrapped around her shoulders, but she did not feel its bite. Something inside her had grown warmer, more solid. A hearth newly lit in the chamber beneath the earth was not simply a vow to the old ways, it was an invitation, and the land had accepted. The wolves had answered. The guardian had returned. But what lay ahead? What it meant to restore not just memory but meaning? That had only just begun. She stepped forward from the cave's mouth, her boots finding soft soil and lichen-covered stone. The wind at this height was strong but not wild. It carried scents she did not recognize, of distant meadows, deep bark, ancient rivers untainted by time. The very air felt different, like a breath held in anticipation. She began the descent, following the winding slope that led from the heights of the cliff to the vale below, each step steady, unhurried. The sword tapped lightly against her back, a quiet rhythm to her movement. She no longer rushed to catch up. She no longer wandered. She was walking the path of her own making now, and the land shifted around her with the subtle grace of recognition. As she approached the circle of wolves, they turned toward her, not in unison, not as a pack moved by instinct, but each in their own time, each in their own silence. Their eyes met hers, and in them, Mira saw not the feral gleam of beast or the cunning of predator, but something gentler, stranger, a familiarity born not of having known her, but of knowing what she carried. The echo of the pact, the renewal of the flame. She passed through the ring and none barred her way. Some stepped aside, one lowered its head, another let out a sound, half whine, half chuff, that was almost laughter. And in the center, the wolfhound turned and met her gaze, no longer towering above her, no longer separate. They stood now as two threads of the same weave. What unfolded next did not require language. The hound stepped to the side and Myra found herself at the center of the circle, with wolves now seated or crouched in a wide spiral around her. The ground beneath her feet felt different, softer, older, a place of memory carved by countless paws and seasons. She knelt slowly, placed the sword before her, and rested her palms upon the earth. And she spoke not aloud but inwardly. She let her thoughts spill into the soil like water from a cup. She spoke of forgetting, of wandering, of hearing a song no one else could hear and following it into the dark. She spoke of snow and silence and the feeling of being watched not by an enemy, but by something waiting. She spoke of the sword, of the pact, of the dream that had called her name before she'd even known she had one. She offered these thoughts to the earth, not as confession, but as seed, and the ground listened. Beneath her hands the soil pulsed faintly, as though something deep within it was stirring, a slow, immense awakening. Around her the wolves did not move, but she could feel their presence like a wall of breath and spirit. The wolfhound sat just beyond the circle, head lifted slightly, eyes closed, as though it too were dreaming. And from the base of the sword, roots began to grow. They emerged slowly, tendrils of light and wood weaving outward from the blade and sinking into the soil. They moved not with hunger, but with purpose, linking stone to spirit, steel to earth. The sword was not simply a weapon. It was a key, a vessel, a memory made tangible. And now it was anchoring her oath, not as something she carried, but something she became. A soft sound rippled through the air then, low and harmonic, not from throat or sky, but from the ground itself. The mountain was singing again, though this time the song was gentler, like a lullaby hummed by the bones of the world, and in that song was a promise that what had been sundered could be joined, that memory could become root, that guardians once called would never again be forgotten. The light from the sword faded slowly, and the roots ceased their movement, now buried fully in the earth. Mira opened her eyes, tears clinging to her lashes, not from sorrow, but from a fullness too vast to name. She stood once more, her body aching not with fatigue, but with transformation. She was no longer merely the girl who had heard the howl and followed. She was now the voice that answered. The wolves rose with her. Together they howled, not a mournful cry, not a warning, but a song of welcome, of return. It rose through the trees and across the valley, echoing against the cliffs and reaching beyond the veil of wind and time. And as their song soared, lights flickered to life in the distance. Small, steady flames blooming across the mountainside, across the forests, in places thought empty, long forgotten. They were not alone. Elsewhere others had remembered. As the last echoes of the wolves' song faded into the folds of the valley, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It was rich, layered with 1,000 voices just beyond hearing, like embers beneath snow. Mira stood in the heart of it all, her breath slow, her chest rising and falling as if she were still catching up to what her spirit had already become. Around her the wolves moved not with urgency, but with a profound calm, their bodies weaving through the space like ribbons of shadow and light, as if dancing through an old ritual that remembered its steps, even after centuries of stillness. The wolfhound stood quietly at her side, no longer a guardian bound by grief, but a companion untethered at last by new purpose. Their eyes met, and nothing needed to be said. Between them now was a bond too deep for language, a thread woven not in fate but in choice, and it sang with the quiet hum of the world remade. The valley, too, had changed. Where once it had slept beneath the frost of forgotten ages, now it breathed anew. The air shimmered with a life not born of warmth, but of awakening, a stillness that did not rest but listened. Trees that had stood silent and brittle now stretched taller, their limbs creaking not from age, but from the stretch of long-stilled limbs. The wind carried not just the chill of the highlands, but the scent of pine and peat, of deep earth stirred, of moss reclaiming the stone. It was as if the land itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the moment when someone would remember how to speak to it. Not with commands, not with chains, but with reverence. Mira had not come to claim the wolves. She had come to meet them, and in doing so, she had reminded the land how to remember. Night fell gently across the sky, folding the world into hues of violet and ash, but the wolves did not retreat into darkness. They moved among the shadows like memories half recalled, watching her, studying her, not as a leader or a savior, but as one of their own. Not equal by blood or form, but by spirit, by the rhythm that pulsed now in her veins and echoed beneath the pads of their feet. One of the younger wolves, pale-furred and wide-eyed, stepped close and pressed its nose to her wrist. She knelt, smiling, her fingers brushing the creature's thick ruff. In that moment there was no past, no prophecy, only presence, raw and radiant. They would not stay in this valley forever. That much she knew, not from vision, but from certainty woven into her bones. The pact had been reawakened, yes, but it was not meant to be confined to one forgotten corner of the world. The oath was a living thing, and it had roots now, and those roots must grow. There were still places where the silence had deepened into sorrow, where the howl of the old ones had been drowned by steel and fire. There were lands that did not remember the names of their rivers, where the sky had forgotten how to speak to the trees. And there were people, lost and wandering, who carried within them the ache of something they could not name, the ache of disconnection. For them, too, the pact must be known. Meera rose slowly, her hand brushing the hilt of the sword now sheathed once more upon her back. It no longer burned, no longer glowed, but its weight was reassuring, like a heartbeat slumbering between breaths. The wolves gathered around her, not in a formation of war, but in a quiet procession of unity. They would move not as hunters, not as a force to be feared, but as reminders, as echoes. As the old songs returned at last to the mouths of those who had stopped singing, and so they began to walk, down through the vale where mist clung to the roots of trees like old stories, across ridges where bones of forgotten beasts rested beneath moss, over streams whose waters glistened with the faint memory of starlight. They did not hurry, for the journey was not measured in miles, but in meaning. Wherever they stepped, the land softened, stirred, reached upward. Birds returned to branches with careful calls. Deer emerged from hidden dens, their ears tilted in wonder. The world did not fear them. The world knew them. They came upon an old road, cracked stone and weed-ridden, the remnant of a path once carved by feet and hooves and wheels. Meera paused there, one hand brushing a moss-covered milestone. The letters were almost gone, worn down by rain and forgetting, but she traced them anyway, whispering the name of a village she had never seen. Rowland's Ford. The name felt like an ember in her mouth, something almost extinguished. She looked to the Wolfhound, who met her gaze with the quiet calm of agreement. They would go there next, not because there was danger, not because there was war, but because there was silence. And silence left untended could become a wound. The wolves padded forward, and Meera followed, the sword upon her back, the memory of the pact in her heart, the wind brushing her cheeks like the breath of the world itself. The road stretched ahead, winding through trees and shadow, but the path was clear. She did not know who she would meet, what faces would greet her, what doubts would challenge her, but she knew this: the howl had returned to the wind. The earth remembered its name, and the guardian no longer walked alone. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of night, the world was waiting. Morning arrived not with brightness, but with a hush, a pale light filtering through the canopy like breath across glass, tentative, reverent. Mira walked at the head of the silent procession, the wolves moving behind her in undulating currents of fur and shadow, their footfalls soft as falling leaves. The old road wound through a forest gone wild with neglect, where vines had reclaimed stone and roots had burst through the pathways like truths long buried, but no longer willing to be quiet. Every so often they passed remnants of what had once been, a moss-draped statue of a warrior whose name was now known only to Lycan, a crumbling bridge where ivy held hands across broken arches, a well whose stones still whispered of wishes cast into its depth by trembling hands. Mira saw these things not with sorrow, but with tenderness. The past did not grieve her, it called to her. And in answering she carried not just the oath of the wolves, but the grace of remembering. They came upon Roland's Ford just as the sun breached the distant hills, its light casting long, slanted rays that pierced the mist and painted the village in gold-edged shadow. It was not much of a place. No walls, no banners, no gleaming towers. Just a cluster of stone cottages nestled in the curve of a shallow stream, where smoke rose in thin threads from hearths, and the smell of peat mingled with that of river reeds and frost-wet earth. The houses leaned slightly with age, their thatch faded to the color of ash, but they were lived in. Mira could see the signs, a wheelbarrow tipped beside a garden fence, chickens rooting through the fallen leaves, boots lined up neatly by a door. Life still pulsed here, quiet and stubborn. But something else hung over the village, subtle and heavy. A weariness not born of hunger or storm, but of something deeper. The silence was not peaceful, it was tight, measured, as though even the wind here dared not speak too loudly. Mira slowed her steps, the wolves following suit, their bodies tensing not with aggression but with alertness. The wolfhound patted beside her, its head high, ears pricked, each paw placed with deliberate care. They stepped from the forest and into the village's gaze. The first to see them was a child. He stood at the edge of the stream, a wooden bowl in his hands, frozen mid-May as he watched the wolves emerge from the mist like a tide of forgotten legends. His eyes were wide, not with fear but awe. The bowl slipped from his fingers and vanished into the water, but he did not turn to run. Instead, he simply whispered, "They've come." That whisper carried. Windows opened, doors creaked, faces appeared, weathered, wary, pale with disbelief. The people of Roland's Ford emerged slowly, like sleepers waking from a long and restless dream, and gathered at the edges of their paths, their gardens, their porches. Some clutched brooms or scythes. One old man held a rusted sword in shaking hands, but did not lift it. No one screamed, no one fled. They simply watched as the wolves moved through their village, and as Mira stepped into their square, the sword upon her back a quiet flame. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her face lined not by age alone, but by years of holding sorrow at bay. Her eyes met Mira's, and in them flickered something that had not lived there for a long time. Recognition, not of the girl, but of what she bore. "You're not one of us," the woman said, her voice steady but soft like a river under ice. "And yet you carry something that belongs to us all." Mira nodded. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a speech. She simply spoke the truth, plain and clear as the morning air. I carry a vow once made and once forgotten, but it is remembered now. I walk with the guardians. I do not come to rule. I come to return. A murmur moved through the gathered villagers, like wind finding its voice again. "Return what?" asked a younger man, arms crossed over a chest tight with skepticism. "Wolves? They bring nothing but blood." The wolfhound stepped forward then, and though its gaze never wavered from calm, its presence struck deeper than any growl. Mayra turned to the man, not in challenge, but an invitation. "They are not here to hunt you," she said. "They have never hunted you. They have waited, watched, guarded what we forgot. This land, it was never meant to be tamed by force. It was meant to be walked with. We broke that pact. We silenced the howl. Now it is rising again, not in wrath, but in need. You can fear it, or you can remember." There was silence again, but a different silence now, looser, widened. The woman stepped forward, placing a hand on Mira's shoulder. "Then speak it," she said. "Speak the oath. Let us hear it. Let us choose." Mira closed her eyes, and as the wolves formed a circle around the square, as the morning light caught the edge of the sword's hilt and turned it to gold, she spoke. Not with grandeur, not with pretense, but with truth. "I vow to walk with shadow, to listen when the earth speaks, to howl when the wind forgets its song. I vow to guard the silence, to speak the names of the forgotten, to honor the wolves who still wait." She opened her eyes and found that others had knelt. Not all, not yet, but some, and the land listened, and the pact breathed. The air shifted as Mira's words settled into the soil, as if the earth beneath the village had exhaled after holding its breath for generations. The moment did not erupt, it unfolded, like a thawing stream, quiet and steady, its current winding through the stillness of the people who now stood caught between disbelief and something far older, remembrance. Those who had knelt did not rise quickly, nor did they kneel from fear or submission. They had done so not because they understood the words fully, but because something within those words stirred something long buried within themselves. A hunger not for power or certainty, but for connection, to land, to sky, to the part of their soul that had always known the wind should carry more than cold, that wolves were not curses in fur, but kin forgotten. Their kneeling was not allegiance, it was apology and hope. The wolfhound moved among them with grace and gravity, its massive paws silent against the stones of the square. It passed the child who had dropped his bowl, and he reached out with unthinking trust, small fingers brushing the hound's thick fur. He laughed, soft and full of wonder, and that sound broke the last of the silence. For a single heartbeat, the entire village remembered what it meant to be unafraid of magic. Not the kind that burned or shattered, but the kind that soothed, that repaired, that waited patiently beneath snow and song for someone to listen. Eyes turned to the wolves, who stood not as an army, but as family. They did not pace or posture, they did not bare teeth. They simply were. One by one more villagers knelt, not to Mayra, not to the wolves, but to the moment, to the possibility. An old man dropped his sword into the frost-covered grass, the sound of its impact soft, final. A young woman held her hand to her heart and whispered the oath to herself, words trembling on her lips like a lullaby. Others stepped forward, placing their palms upon the ground, upon trees, upon not a ceremony, but a remembering. And through it all, Mara stood at the center, the sword across her back glowing faintly, not with fire, but with light drawn from the hearts around her, each spark rekindled by choice. And as the people of Roland's Ford remembered, so too did the land. The stream that ran beside the village shimmered in the morning light, its waters suddenly clearer, running faster. Birds returned to the trees, not in flocks, but in solitary flutters, as if testing whether the song had truly begun again. Far across the valley a great stag stepped from the shadows, antlers tall as banners, watching in stillness before vanishing once more into the forest. The air no longer hung heavy. It moved, it breathed. The pact had not returned with noise or thunder. It had not been demanded. It had been accepted. And acceptance, Mira understood now, was stronger than conquest. It could not be enforced. It could only be offered, carried, shared. She spent the night in the village, not as a guest, but as one of them. The hearth fire burned low, and she sat beside it, the sword resting on her knees, her fingers idly tracing the runes along its blade. The wolfhound lay at her feet, its breath deep and even, eyes half closed in quiet vigilance. Outside, the wolves watched from the tree line, never straying far but content to let the humans sleep without fear. There was no need to guard, not tonight. Not here. As sleep tugged at her, Mira allowed herself one final thought, not of duty or the road ahead, but of her earliest dream. That first vision, the great black shape beneath the snow, the eyes like embers. How she had woken with her heart pounding and her skin cold, whispering into the dark, "I dreamed of you." She remembered the ache of longing, the sense of something waiting. And now here she was, no longer dreaming but awake, fully, deeply. The road was not ended. It never would be. There would be other villages, other places where the silence had grown thick with forgetting. There would be those who would resist, who would fear, who would try to twist what she carried into something sharp. But that was not her concern. She was not a queen, not a prophet. She was a reminder, a weaver of echoes, a girl who had followed the howl and become its answer. At dawn they would leave, not with banners or farewells, but with the quiet grace of the returning tide. The wolves would walk beside her. The wind would carry her oath. The land would remember her steps. And somewhere just beyond the veil of what is and what could be, the old ones would watch, with eyes like frost and fire, their howls no longer lost in the dark, but singing, soft, steady, beneath the star. The legend of the Wolfhound would not be carved in stone. It would be carried in story, in footstep, in heartbeat. And so it begins. Again.